Okay, I think we might be about set. But there's plenty of people in the room.
Okay.
Okay, great. I'll just start with some introductions and just to thank everyone for joining us today. Introduce myself before I introduce our speaker today. I'm Andrew Warnes. I'm a professor in American literature and American studies in the School of English, and I work on food studies in the humanities. And I'm delighted to welcome you all today and to welcome you to what I think must be the final seminar of 2021 from the DFEI. The title of today's talk is Human Entanglement with Soil, and the talk will be given by our friend and colleague, Professor Stephen Banwart. I appreciate that many of you here will know Steve well, but I'd like to give a sort of slightly formal introduction to sort of suit the occasion and to kind of set out in detail his work in the field of research alongside his directorship of the GFEI, which many will be familiar with. So, as I say, Steve, as you know, is the director of the Global Food and Environment Institute, and he's the leadership chair in integrated soil, agriculture and water research here at Leeds University. His research focuses on Earth's critical zone, the planet's surface layer, and his work has been decisive in integrating soil and water resource research into this field of study. He got his BSc in civil engineering and an MSc in environmental engineering from the University of Iowa, and a PhD in natural environmental science from the Swiss Federal Institute of Technology in Zurich. His core science is basic chemistry, and that's also applied, basic chemistry, which is also applied to the study of soil systems and natural water. And his achievements include combining laboratory experimentation, theoretical mathematical modelling, and data from field studies in order to describe water flow and transport and mechanism of chemical transformations. And the things that have been quantified by this process, I just want to sort of go through them just to kind of get this kind of range of interests and achievements on record. But this helps him quantify our soil functions that produce crops, store and filter infiltrating water, transform nutrients, store carbon from the atmosphere as organic matter, and provide habitat and sustain biodiversity. Also weathering of rock and minerals to deliver solutes to drainage waters in catchments and river basins, including the release of contamination from mining sites. The role of the geological barrier to contain civilian high-level nuclear waste within underground repositories constructed in bedrock. And finally, biogeochemistry and natural biodegradation of hydrocarbon pollution in soil and groundwater aquifers. That's kind of Steve's kind of range of research, and I think the questions about that and about his talk today should probably go to him rather than me as chair, but are warmly encouraged nonetheless. I also wanted just to give a little bit of information about the Institute, which again will be familiar to many here today, but for those who are just joining us for the first time, might be useful. So the Global Food and Environment Institute is an interdisciplinary research community which brings together members from across academia, industry and public policy to work on the integrated challenges of food security and climate change. And there's further information about our activities and about this series of seminars in particular in the chat function, the first entry in the chat, which you'll find there. So before I give way to Professor Banwart, I'd just like to remind you of the seminar etiquette, which is the kind of usual thing, but please ensure that cameras and microphones are switched off for the duration of the seminar. Steve's presentation will take about 20 minutes, and during that time, could I encourage you to use the chat function addressed to everyone with your questions. What I'll do at the end of Steve's presentation is I'll just sort of review that and collate questions and put them to Steve for that 10-minute Q&A session. So this seminar, of course, is being recorded, and the recording will be made via YouTube in due course. So, without further ado, I'm pleased today to introduce Professor Steve Banwart.
Just trying to get my slides to advance. There we go. Thank you, everyone, for joining us today and listening to a discussion about human entanglement with soil. And the seminar today is particularly aligned very well with World Soil Day, which occurs each year on the 5th of December. And this is designated by the United Nations each year for the world to acknowledge the role of soils in human well-being and prosperity, and the urgent need for citizens everywhere to engage with soil, to think about soil, and to appreciate what soil does for the world. I'm going to talk today, I'm going to frame soil within this idea of Earth's critical zone, which is this zone of habitability at the terrestrial surface, the land surface. And it is, of course, the place that humans inhabit. It is our zone of habitation. I'm going to talk about what soil does in the critical zone and mention some of the global threats to what soil does in the critical zone. I'm going to talk a little bit about what makes a good soil, particularly for its provisioning of resources to people. And this provisioning of resources then creates a transactional relationship between citizens and soil. And this is the entanglement that I refer to in the title of this talk. And I will discuss a little bit that entanglement and how we are trying to understand that by working across disciplines and to help us get a handle on how to live well with soil now and into the future. And I'm going to talk about, in doing that, how the need to bring lived experience, particularly from farmers and others who work closely with soil, science evidence, but also the rules of society and bringing these together in order to try to find a destination for how humans and soil can live together in this entanglement and in a way that is good for both and that lasts. And this is about creating future stories of people and place and soil. So Earth's critical zone, this zone of habitability, it extends from the depth of freshwater circulation in the groundwater. So this is bounded at the bottom more or less by the surface of unweathered bedrock, rock from the interior of the Earth that's been pushed up towards the land surface, but is not yet substantially chemically or physically altered. And it extends up through the soil zone and through vegetation up to the top of the vegetation. And so it is this very thin layer of the land surface that provides most of the resources that humans rely on for life. And I often explain to colleagues who aren't from the natural sciences that it is this thin layer, in many places only a few meters thick, that is the only thing that stands between us and annihilation as our planet hurtles through the cold vacuum of space. And so we term it critical because it is this critical interface between geosphere and atmosphere and the water cycle in the Earth system, and the fact that it's under critical pressure due to human resource demand for food and other biomass needs and for water. It's driving intensive land use and it contributes to climate change. And that this zone and these critical pressures need to be dealt with in a positive way because they are critical to human habitation on Earth. And soil is absolutely right at the heart of the critical zone. So what does soil do within the critical zone? We see here a high wall of a quarry. This is at the Planetary experimental catchment in North Wales. And we see this thin layer of the soil here. It is supporting here vegetation for food, fiber, timber production. It's filtering water. We can see the leakage through the soil coming out at this rock face. As it filters through the soil, contaminants that might be present in the water can be removed. So this is also transmitting water, and it's also storing water that can go back up to support the vegetation or below the water table that can be drawn up for drinking water. As this soil layer, as it's engage with the water movement, with vegetation. It's transforming nutrients, carbon, nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, the key elements that support vegetation and life. It stores carbon and nitrogen as well, and can draw them out of the atmosphere and prevent their release as greenhouse gases. So it's important in climate regulation. And it is also really the heart of the very rich biological diversity and habitat that is provided by the terrestrial environment. But soil functions globally are under threat. And this includes the physical loss of soil by erosion. This is exemplified here by the satellite image of the Mississippi River Delta and the sediment plume that's coming off this as sediments are moved from the farmland in the river basin down into the Gulf of Mexico, also creating water quality problems that affect fisheries in the Gulf of Mexico. It is the desertification, the loss of soil organic matter that is essential for these nutrient transformations and carbon and nitrogen storage. And this is very important for supporting vegetation. And once you lose the ability to support vegetation, you then lose that ability of vegetation to fix carbon from the atmosphere with photosynthesis and direct it back into the soil. So it's a vicious cycle that depletes soil of organic matter, also making it more susceptible to physical loss and erosion. There's also the loss of terrestrial habitat and biodiversity that impacts soil adversely. This is exemplified here by a logging front in a tropical forest. And there is also the loss of fertility, particularly through intensive agriculture that creates compaction of the soil, particularly heavy machinery and mechanical tillage. The salinization, the evaporation of irrigation water that leaves behind salt deposits, the sealing over of soil, especially by urban development, and contamination of soil by industrial chemicals. And this loss of fertility actually does impact the quality of the food that we eat. This is a nice story online from Scientific American about 10 years ago that was covering how the intensive use of soil and some of these impacts on soil fertility, how these are adversely affecting the nutritional quality of the food crops that we grow, both grain, but also fruit and vegetable through fruit and vegetable horticulture. So there is a direct link to these threats to soil and the quality of nutrition that we have in human diet. So what makes up a good soil? What should we be doing? What should we be looking at to guide us towards preventing degradation of the soil and towards improving soil? And I take a lesson from Russian soil scientists, soil science, which talks about the evidence from centuries of farming experience of an agronomically favorable particle size distribution. And this is the fact that good soil builds large aggregates. It takes the smaller particles of the soil and builds them out together into larger aggregates, something that I call the golden aggregate. And this can be described and understood through really rigorous physics. I'm not going to go into that, but it's reflected in the quantitatively in a soil water retention curve. So this is the amount of water in the soil per kilogram of soil, the kilogram of water that's contained in the pore space. And along the x-axis here, this is essentially a measure of the size of pore throats between aggregates within the soil. And when we have a lot of water in the soil and the soil begins to drain, it's the larger pores which lose water first, and then it's smaller and smaller pores which retain the water as the water content decreases through soil drainage. And this behavior is very much affected by the degree to which these soil particles either remain dispersed or whether they form the golden aggregate. And the rule of thumb is that good agricultural soil has particle sizes greater than 0.25 millimeters or 250 microns, that this makes up particles, aggregates in this size range make up more than 60% of the particle mass of the soil. And that these aggregates are composed of the smaller building blocks of soil, which include fragments of parent rock, the clay minerals, and the nanometric sized oxides, which are secondary minerals which form as the parent rock dissolves, forming these minerals, but also releasing mineral nutrients to the soil, and the living and decaying organic matter within the soil microbiome, and the humus within the soil. And it's influenced as well by the ionic composition of water. So let's build some good soil. And this is a diagram which isn't to scale, but I'm going to step through about how we might imagine good soil is formed. How do we build the golden aggregate, and what do these golden aggregates do? So we can think about the smallest size of particles, these clay-sized texture units. These would be generally considered less than around 50 microns in size, and some medium-sized particles that are considered to be within a 50 to 250 micron size. These are termed silt-sized units of particles. And then we have large sand-sized units, which could be rock fragments of 250 microns or larger. And it is these smaller particles in particular, and the small pore sizes within them, that can retain water, even in a drained soil. And so we have the water that's held between in the pores between the particle sizes. But how do we build the macro aggregates, the golden aggregate? And this is driven by the organic matter that is put into soil. And as we add fresh organic matter, for example, from decaying roots that have grown in the soil, or leaf litter which has entered the soil, for example, during plant dieback in the autumn or after harvest, we get bacterial biofilms that grow on this particulate organic matter. So this is fresh organic matter. It provides a source of energy and carbon for the soil microbes to live and grow and build biomass. And they draw on this nutrition source to build these biofilms. And as we build these biofilms growing on the surfaces of the organic matter, the polymers within the biofilms that are biologically produced cause these smaller particle sizes to stick to the organic matter. And this drives the formation of these macro aggregates, the golden aggregate. And within these larger aggregates, we have clusters of smaller aggregates. And within these, of course, we can retain the water in these smaller pores, which is tightly held, but can be available for plants, for plant growth. And within these macro aggregates, the bacteria that are growing there, these biofilms that are forming, these where oxygen is present from air that's around the golden aggregate, these biofilms consume the oxygen in microbial respiration. And this can lead, even within these small, these macro aggregates, within the center, you can have anaerobic cores where bacteria are living without oxygen. And this anaerobic core then creates a pathway for oxygen diffusion from atmospheric concentrations where there's none in the center of the core to diffuse in and support the microbial respiration. But as microbial respiration occurs, both aerobically and anaerobically, some of the products of that respiration as the organic matter decays are things like carbon dioxide, like nitrous oxide, and even methane from an anaerobic zone within a macro aggregate. And these you might recognize as all being greenhouse gases. So in addition to potentially producing greenhouse gases through organic matter decomposition, the anaerobic core helps protect this organic matter from the relatively more rapid decomposition where there's oxygen present. But as the organic matter decomposes, either slowly under anaerobic conditions or more quickly under aerobic conditions near the surface, it's releasing the phosphorus, the nitrogen, the carbon, the other nutrients within the organic matter, and as well, it's driving the dissolution of these small rock and mineral fragments which release mineral nutrients. And then we have another important part of the soil microbiome, and this is the soil fungi, especially the mycorrhizal fungi, which are connected back into the vegetation attached to the roots. And these fungi draw on chemical compounds produced by photosynthesis. And these compounds then are used to metabolize by the fungi to grow their biomass. And as the fungal hyphae grow through the soil, they're able to contact this zone of decomposing organic matter and dissolving mineral fragments and draw up nutrients that take back to the plant. So this is a very important part of how soil is providing nutrition to vegetation. But as we form the golden aggregates. As these larger aggregates form, they leave behind then zones which are relatively wider pores, which are free draining, which allow water to drain under wet conditions. And it allows oxygen ingress through these larger pores, and that supports root respiration, which also gives additional CO2 efflux from vegetation growth through the root respiration in the soil zone. So this is an example of how you build a good soil. And it is very much, you can understand that this is very much around maintaining a supply of fresh organic matter to sustain the growth of these golden aggregates and to sustain this cycling of nutrient transformation, which helps support vegetation. So this kind of picture explains why high organic matter soils tend to be more productive in terms of fertility and especially for agricultural production. And here's a picture of a soil. The one on the left is from a hedgerow, which has a high organic matter. It's not been tilled, it's not been disturbed. It has a relatively larger vegetation canopy of the hedgerow plants, drawing down carbon dioxide and putting organic matter into the soil and building these golden aggregates. And you have here soil from the center of an arable field that's undergoing intensive tilling. And you can see this difference, that this is much more friable, much looser. And this is exemplified by the higher amount of the golden aggregate in this type of a soil under these conditions. And these are more productive soils. And so this shows some of the impacts of tillage and intensive agricultural practices on compaction and on reducing the abundance of macro aggregates and on not being beneficial to producing good soil structure. I'm going to transition now, and I'm going to talk about how this soil and this good soil that we might want to form, its role in providing resources to humans. And we know that globally, our agricultural regions are providing food and other types of biomass for textiles to the population. And we know that this is driving, amongst other things like hydrocarbon combustion, some of the big global challenges like the climate crisis and habitat destruction, which is driving what I call the great extinction, the loss of global biodiversity. And what I'm going to do here is to talk about some of the work that is ongoing, where we try to make some of these planetary challenges more personal by looking at what are some of the effects of soil production, the provisioning of resources through good soils to people, and also the demand that people place on soils in terms of the resources that they use. And we do this by looking at the per capita footprint of the amount of resource provisioning from soils and the per capita footprint of human use of these flows. And we can do this, first of all, by calculating what is the amount of per capita area of habitable land, and it's just over a half a hectare. So on average, with the current global population, there's about a half a hectare of land, of habitable land area, to provide the resource needs of each person. And to give you an idea of this population density, if we had an unobstructed site to the horizon, for my height, I'm just over 6 feet tall, looking out to the horizon with an unobstructed view, I'd have a line of sight, which is around 5 kilometers. And if I do a slow spin of 360 degrees, I would be looking out over a population density that would encompass around 10,000 people, the size of a small town. So it's trying to relate some of these numbers about land use and human population to something which is more immediately recognizable from human experience. So this provisioning of energy by solar capture of the land surface, and then what soil provides, this scales with land area. More hectares creates more photosynthesis capture, more solar capture, more water capture for catchments, and provisioning of biomass, for example, food production. But the resource use scales with population, with the number of people and the amount of resource that they use. So just some globally average numbers are interesting to compare here. If we look at energy, about 187 gigajoules per day per capita, and humans actually use just a very tiny fraction, about 1/1000th of the solar energy that actually falls on the land surface each day. And water, it's the same. There's a very large supply of fresh water. We use only a small amount of it each day. But the challenge with water is it's not always where we need it, and it's not always there at the time that we need it. It's very variable geographically and very variable in time. And in carbon, what is captured by photosynthesis, we're actually putting back, we're using about double that. And that reflects this climate crisis and the fact that we use quite a lot of carbon from fossil fuels, and we're actually doubling about the amount of carbon that we use each day compared to what's fixed by photosynthesis. And nitrogen, what's provided in undisturbed ecosystems is around 40 grams of nitrogen per day per capita. But what we use for fertilizer production and supporting our diet is more than that. And if we look at phosphorus, which is released by the weathering of phosphate rock within soil environments, we use quite a lot more, and that's through mining phosphorus rock and spreading it on the land surfaces as fertilizer. If we take a look at some of these numbers, these are just some examples around the terrestrial carbon balance. So this is, our photosynthesis and respiration are broadly in balance. Plants fix about 4 megatons of carbon per year, and that's returned to the atmosphere through microbial respiration of soils. But then the human use of carbon is putting back about 8.9, so around double that each year into the atmosphere. And this is what is driving, of course, the climate crisis. Most of this is through fossil fuel combustion, but a significant amount of it is due to land use change, which is driven by the demand for land for food production. So food production is contributing in this way directly to loss of habitat and the climate crisis. But if we look at nitrogen, we get a slightly more complex story. If we have undisturbed ecosystems, they're fixing about 41 grams of nitrogen per person today on average, and returning most of that back into the atmosphere through a process of nitrogen processing in soil of denitrification. But this is only the terrestrial environment. If we include the oceans, this balances out a little bit more. But where we are using land for food production, we have a much greater, about 50% greater fixation of nitrogen. And this is both industrial fixation for mineral fertilizer production, but also industrial scale planting of legume crops, particularly soy, to fix nitrogen for plant protein production. Quite a lot of this nitrogen is never used by people. It goes back into the environment as what we call reactive nitrogen species. This could be nitrate pollution to water courses or groundwater, or nitrous oxide or other gases that go back into the atmosphere. And some of these are powerful greenhouse gases. So human dietary demand is a very small amount, only about 11 grams per day on average currently, but that's more the global average and what is recommended for a good diet. So we overuse protein on the global average, but that dietary consumption in some cases is being recovered from sanitation and is being applied producing organic fertilizer that goes back into the land. So trying to create a closed loop between diet and food production. And there's quite a lot of nitrogen that goes into the atmosphere just from fossil fuel combustion, the nitrogen that's within the fossil fuel that's being burned. Of course, there's no place and no person on the planet is average. We have areas of very high demand for resources and very low provisioning of resources. And this example would be Lower Manhattan in New York City. And we might characterize this by a somewhat glib characterization of gold soil, a wealthy urban center with sealed soils that has to bring all its food from someplace else. But there are other parts of the world which are the breadbasket zones, which are sometimes referred to as black soil regions because of the high organic matter content of the soil. These are in sedimentary basins with savanna biomes that are home to intensive monoculture farming that produce high export volume, often to feed the dietary demands of people living in gold soil regions. But we can also think of this transitioning in agriculture to restorative agricultural practices that are trying to balance these resource flows, the carbon, the nitrogen, the phosphorus, potassium, and to create a more sustainable agricultural system. And we might call these green soils, this transitioning where more indigenous crops are mixed together. There's a lesser intensity of production, but this leads to improved soil. It sequesters carbon, it builds the golden aggregate. And this is pointing towards a type of land use in agriculture, which is more in balance with resource demand, what we ask of soil and what we maintain in soil and put back into soil. And then where we have very low provisioning flows, but also low use, this is particularly characterized, I call these are these urbanized, heavily impacted soils, particularly in the urban slums of the global south, where we have dense housing, often not so much air pollution control, so quite a lot of industrial pollution as fallout in rainfall onto soil. There's low access to nutrition, often because of poverty, and there's only very basic sanitation. So these are just explaining a little bit how we and colleagues that I work with are starting to think about place. In certain places, there are very different cultural norms which drive how we use soil and the demands that we place on soil. And that affects very much huge differences with place in the provisioning of resources by soil and the use of resources by people. And I'm just going to wrap up a little bit with how we think about trying to resolve these differences within place and to bring the demands that humans place on soil and our entanglement with soil into balance with what soil can provide, so that we can sustain soil and make our entanglement and our relation with soil last. If we persist in taking more out than we put back, ultimately soil becomes exhausted and can no longer do the things that humans expect of soil. And we can think about doing this if we combine lived experience, particularly of those that live on the land and work with soil, particularly farmers and other parts of the agri-food supply chains, but also the rules that are in place in a region, things like land ownership laws and how we are allowed to use natural resources like water rights, and combining the sort of issues of governance and experience together with scientific evidence and bringing these together and creating what I call future stories. And there are examples of how this is done. This is one example of a community forum where people are gathered together to discuss what do they want, how can they achieve a lasting relationship with the environment that allows them to use soil productively and to nourish their entanglement with soil so that it lasts in a productive way. And some of the steps that might be included here are thinking about how do you create stories of future trajectories of how a community develops, how a household develops that will be successful in a relationship with soil. What are the ambitions of people? What do they want? And who do they want to benefit and in what way? And what outcomes and actions are possible? What can soil and the critical zone and their entanglement with it provide for them? What are the limitations? It can be limited by climate, can be limited by rainfall. What pathways for drawing on this information can be sketched out for a successful development and future story of what's possible in a productive way? What alternatives are there? What resources are needed in order to achieve that future destination that this kind of development of future stories and plans can lead to? What partnerships and advocacy are needed to help make this possible? And then what plans can be put in place to take action and bring this story to life for a better future for the next generation and beyond? And these are some of the components that we see are very important in developing sustainable futures. It's very much linking lived experience, the natural environment, and a notion of what citizens want and what they want to do and what they need from the environment. So I'm going to stop there. This is my point of departure of my story of human entanglement with soil. But I do want to just mention some acknowledgements. And a lot of this thinking is very interdisciplinary, cross-sector, bringing many different walks of life and fields of academic study together. And a really nice example of how this is brought together is in this wonderful book, Critical Zones, the Science and Politics of Landing on Earth. It's edited by Bruno Latour and Peter Weibel, and it's a reflection of a really rich collaboration that I and critical zone scientists have with colleagues in France, Bruno Latour and Jerome Gaillardet, who are very much leaders on natural sciences and humanities around critical zone thinking, but also my colleague Leslie Green, who is a Cheney Fellow based at University of Cape Town, but visiting Leeds, who looks at from a humanities and social sciences point of view, the interactions of rock, water, and life, including human. My colleague Andrew, who's kindly chairing today, and his work on what is driving global consumerism, that demand of humans that we place on soil is part of this picture. And my colleague Anna Kurzwierzynska at University of Sheffield, and she leads the Soil Care Network that some of you may interact with, a brilliant collection of people from around the world that draw on social sciences leadership in particular to think of the human entanglement of soil. And then colleagues that I've worked with over the years that have contributed very productively to a book that I helped edit called Soil Carbon, Science, Management, and Policy for Multiple Benefits. So very rich cross-section of social sciences, policy, natural sciences, and agronomists that contribute some of the content there. So I'll stop there. And if we have time for questions, I will happily try to answer these.
Great. Thanks very much, Steve. We have got a couple of questions coming in. Let me just, what I'll do is, sticking to the format, is just sort of read them out. We've got a question from Fiona Smith. Fiona's just written to us, what do you think are the main blockages to achieving these future stories?
I think a main blockage is the scale overall of resource demand. And I think it is tied very much, in my view, to some of the things I learned from you, Andrew, around consumerism. I think resource demand reduction is essential, and it's the elephant in the room that never seems to really be stated clearly. And I think we saw this in COP26. So I think reducing demand is very important, but it is also this spatial variability in what the critical zone can provide, what soil can provide, and the spatial variability and the cultural variability in what humans want and use and expect. And so there's this mismatch. We may have urban centers, they obviously can't produce the food, so that has to come from somewhere. So to me, it is the scale of resource demand, and it is this mismatch of place between places for demand for resources. And this is then where connectivity between place in terms of trade starts to become very, very important.
Great. I think sort of overlapping or kind of an affinity is the question from Pippa Chapman. So it might sort of speak to the same issues. And Pippa has written, future stories are a great idea, but how do we do this well in developed countries where most people are removed from soil and food production? How is this playing out in the UK, for example, at the moment as a result of Brexit?
Okay, so that last slide that I showed around deliberative fora, I want to give an example of another problem, but think about how we might apply this to the challenge that Pippa articulated very, very well. How do we get a transition to occur? About 15 years ago, nanotechnology was in the news, and there was deep concern and a lot of negative press going out to citizens about the threat of nanotechnology. It could be it could lead to a very dystopian future with a great deal of harm to humans. The government actually funded a really interesting social sciences project that ran these deliberative fora, and citizens from all walks of life, about 25 or so, were selected and brought together for a couple of months on weekends to conduct a citizens hearing on nanotechnology. And I experienced it because I was one of the expert witnesses around what happens to nanoparticles from engineering that would get released in the environment. And I talked about soil, water, chemical threats, and so on, and how these are analyzed and what nanoparticles might do. But through the course of that citizen hearing, this group became the experts on this topic. They knew more than any scientist. I might know more about soil and nanoparticles in soil, but they knew more in the breadth of the challenge more than any technical expert. And they brought that lived experience into their thinking, and they challenged these experts. And in the end, they came, to my mind, to a very rational and reasonable conclusion, was that there was some aspects of nanotechnology that needed to be curtailed, at least for a while, as more evidence was gathered as to their potential impact. However, other applications were clearly going to be beneficial and should be allowed to proceed, but with some regulation and some observation of the potential impacts. And I like that idea of having that type of citizen fora. I would love to bring in Yorkshire, where I'm living, I would love to bring the agricultural community together with our urban neighborhoods in such a discussion. What kind of food system do citizens want? What kind of food system is possible in terms of an economic transition for farmers? What would be sustainable in terms of the things that Pippa raised about, environmental sustainability of farming, and also the role of diet in driving that. So that is a methodology that I'm interested in. And it's a methodology that I think is happening within individual farm households around the dinner table. And I think it's a methodology that's happening in farmer groups as they get together and think about how do we transition to this more sustainable future that might just be more profitable, because the citizens may want better quality food that is better for the environment, and it might cost us less to do less tillage and less fertilization and so on.
Thanks, Steve. There's an interesting question from Hannah Udall. I'm sorry if I've got that name wrong, Hannah, but we'll come to that in a moment, because there's also a question from Andrew. I'm sorry, Andrew, I can't see your full name here, but it offers a kind of challenge to this. So it's the kind of obstacle that needs to be faced. So Andrew writes, great talk, Steve. Reducing consumption is not what the big food corporations want, and they have the power and incentives to drive consumption. These companies never commit to reducing consumption. Is this not the cause of the problem?
It's consumption, resource demand is clearly one of the causes of the problem. I'm the cause of the problem. I don't think it's fair for me to shift the blame from my consumption to a global brand. So I think it's up to individual citizens to make better decisions. This is about, if I go back to that nitrogen cycle, there is a clear closing of that nitrogen sustainability gap that is around less protein consumption. That might be around, it doesn't necessarily, from the numbers that I crunch, require wholesale transition to veganism planet-wide, but it definitely requires less use of mineral fertilizer and a reduction in dietary meat consumption to some degree on average around the world. So these are all aspects that I think come down to individual and to household. And so I think we have to step up as citizens to be able to understand this. I think where the gap is, and what is allowing the big companies, if you want to now say, okay, but they can get by with it because of the power that they hold and their influence on markets and what they can provide for consumer choice that I have available to me in the supermarket or elsewhere. So what is allowing companies to get by with it, in my view, is that this problem that was just articulated, isn't this the cause of the problem? I agree. Yes, this is the cause of the problem. But the reason this problem exists partly is because the scale, the climate crisis, the great extinction, in my mind, is so large, it's really hard for individual citizens to really get and to understand these challenges. So it's very hard for a citizen to have that understanding that this is a crisis. So to me, this notion of making information much more at a personal level and informing people at that personal scale, this is what you individually per capita are doing through food choices or through transport choices, et cetera, are doing to the planet is essential. And I think that to me, this idea of getting much more transparency in information to consumers is part of the problem, but it's also making it clear through that transparency of information to the board of those companies and to their shareholders and investors, this is what your actions are doing. Now, my sense is right now, large corporate interests get the impact of what their organization is doing to the climate crisis and the great extinction. And they really don't want to be hit with this reputationally or tagged with it historically. And we do see shareholder activism starting to play a role. So I'm watching that very, very carefully. But that's because those shareholders are starting to get, as individual citizens, these points that I'm making. So I'm looking for ways to accelerate that information to citizens, including those shareholders and including investors. So the sources of finance are saying, I'm not going to give you the money, or you're going to pay twice the interest rate on this business development commercial lending unless you do something about your carbon footprint or whatever. There's a lot wrapped up in that, but I'm just trying to give some sense, thinking out loud, to this question. I think the question is absolutely right. I'm trying to think about some of the practical aspects of how we can address this question. But I think citizens have to be aware that they are to blame. It's what we want and what we need is what is driving this ultimately.
Thanks, Steve. I realise some people will need to go to other meetings and such like, but I think maybe we have time for one final question, which is just moving back to the golden aggregate slide. And these are the questions from Hannah. So again, apologies for any mispronunciation here, but Hannah asks two kind of related questions. How does the application of biochar affect mycelial networks? Do you think biochar is an effective way of increasing soil goodness? And also, Hannah presumes there's a slightly different optimum golden aggregate for different types of crop. Suitable crop and soil type currently matched in agriculture?
So the very coarse metric of the golden aggregate that comes from Russian soil scientists, soil science, is very much influenced by, I am assuming, and I don't know the deep roots of the golden aggregate, this more than 60% of soil mass being in macro aggregates greater than 250 microns in size. But I assume that's coming probably from these what we would call those black soil rich breadbasket regions of Russia. So my sense is, in a most explicitly, that type of rule is more directly explicitly related to those types of soils, what might be in that 4-quadrant diagram that I showed, the black soil regions. And I agree that this will be somewhat different for each type of soil, climate, vegetation, and land use. Yeah. Right. And the biochar. I see so much, I go to so many soil science conferences where I see sessions on biochar, and I see such variation in results and such variation in claims. And I for me personally, I'm not sure of the benefits of biochar. Definitely, it's a more recalcitrant form of carbon, which lasts long and takes carbon out of the atmosphere and puts it into soil. I've seen some examples where biochar can support and improve soil fertility. I don't know if the mechanistic understanding of that, for example, through fungal mycelia, celial interactions with the biochar, are understood. It would be interesting to see what details are in the literature on that. Where I do see improvements that I personally understand from my scientific background of a role for biochar and soil fertility is biochar. There is definitely, from studies that I've to a small degree been involved with, but also collaborate with groups who do this, I do see definite evidence of improved soil fertility and plant growth where biochar is used in somewhat contaminated soils, where organic pollution and heavy metals and so on tend to stick and immobilize on the biochar, and so are not available as in terms of ecotoxicology to adversely affect soil biota and soil fertility.
Hannah's just followed that up. I think this question is not about contaminated soils specifically, but soils generally. She asked, would it be more beneficial adding plant organic matter to the soil directly?
So for my view, I like the idea of adding fresh plant organic matter directly. And we have to be aware that there are examples where that is done in certain ways. That carbon and the nitrogen in it goes very quickly back to the atmosphere as CO2 and nitrous oxide as greenhouse gases. So how you use fresh plant organic matter is also very important. But in my view, I would like to see a circular economy where more plant residue goes back to the soil, or sanitation waste, sludges and so on are processed as organic fertilizers that go back to soil without that thermal processing and loss of carbon that does occur during biochar formation. So I do favor plant residue, and you might say not thermally altered plant matter and biomass going back to soil.
Great, thanks very much, Steve. We're kind of pushing towards the 1 o'clock mark. There's still a lot of people in the room, which is great, but I wanted to just wrap this up here by thanking you, Steve, for a fascinating and very enabling talk, and thanking those of us such interesting questions, and for people for sticking with us through this presentation. But I'll wrap it up there, and thanks again, Steve.
And just thanks to everybody who attended and who chose to stay on. Very grateful for that, and thank you, Andrew.
Great. Thanks, everyone. See you. Cheers. Bye.